Vivavo's CCM is about to self-assess its performance on Eligibility Requirement 6. Your role as a consultant will be to guide the CCM and facilitate discussions and use of the CCM self-assessment tool. Ask 2 volunteers to read out the principle and the full denomination of the ER, taking turns.
Principle: ensuring appropriate management of conflict of interest.
CCM eligibility requirement. To ensure adequate management of conflict of interest, the Global Fund requires all CCMs to 1. Develop and publish a policy to manage conflict of interest that applies to all CCM members across all CCM functions. The policy must state that CCM members will periodically declare conflicts of interest affecting themselves or other CCM members. The policy must state, and CCMs must document, that members will not take part in decisions where there is an obvious conflict of interest, including decisions relating to oversight and selection or financing of PRs or SRs. 2. Apply their conflict of interest policy throughout the life of the Global Fund grants and present documented evidence of its application to the Global Fund on request.
In the same manner as Eligibility Requirements 4 and 5, Eligibility Requirement 6 relates to issues of power and influence. A tendency to deny the existence of conflict of interest, real or perceived, may quickly appear among some CCM members. As a facilitator, your role will be not to condemn conflict of interest, but to guide the CCM to understand what conflict of interest means, why conflict of interest is inherent to the nature of CCMs, in what ways, through what processes and situations conflicts of interest manifest within CCMs, why conflicts of interest are dangerous for CCMs, why managing conflicts of interest is critical for CCMs. Once the principles and the rationale for the eligibility requirement are understood, take the CCM members through the assessment process, ER by ER, MS by MS. Ask a volunteer to read out Eligibility Requirement N.
The CCM has a conflict of interest policy with rules and procedures to avoid or mitigate conflict of interest, and CCM members sign a conflict of interest declaration form.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
The CCM conflict of interest policy applies to all members, both members and alternates, and it requires all members in situations of conflict of interest, in particular PR and SR representatives, to recuse from decision-making.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant. The CCM has no conflict of interest policy. Indeterminate compliance. The CCM conflict of interest policy doesn't apply to all members or doesn't require all members in situation of conflict of interest, in particular PR and SR representatives, to recuse from decision making. Fully compliant. The CCM conflict of interest policy applies to all members and requires members in situation of conflict of interest to recuse from decision making.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. Vivavo's CCM may submit its conflict of interest management policy. Since it now has a conflict of interest policy, Vivavo's CCM is likely to assess itself as fully compliant. Your role as a facilitator will be to guide the CCM to ensure the content of the conflict of interest policy is fully in line with the fully compliant indicator. The policy must apply to all members, not just some constituencies, and must require members in situations of conflict of interest to recuse from decision-making. If any of these two conditions isn't met, you should lead Vivavu CCM to accepting an indeterminate compliance rating. Also, you should draw the Vivavu CCM's attention to the fact that few members have actually seen the policy, which is another CCM performance issue. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to enter information explaining the rating. For example, selective application of the policy or no provision for recusal, as well as corrective actions such as editing of the conflict of interest policy, bearing in mind that the improvement plan will allow the CCM to capture all performance improvement measures. Ask a volunteer to read out eligibility requirement N.
CCM has a conflict of interest policy with rules and procedures to avoid or mitigate conflict of interest, and CCM members sign a conflict of interest declaration form.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
CCM members have signed a conflict of interest declaration form.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant. Less than 80% of CCM members have signed a conflict of interest declaration form. Indeterminate compliance. Between 80 and 99% of CCM members have signed a conflict of interest declaration form. Fully compliant. 100% of CCM members have signed a conflict of interest declaration form.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. In the case of Vivavu CCM, no signed conflict of interest declaration forms are available, so there are no documents to submit. Since there are no signed conflict of interest declaration forms, Vivavu's performance for this indicator is non-compliant. Your role as a facilitator is to support the CCM in identifying whether the conflict of interest policy includes the signing of conflict of interest declaration forms. If yes, understand why such forms have not been signed so far, and in both cases, yes or no, decide what can be done to correct the situation. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to enter information which explains the rating, such as limited awareness of the eligibility requirement and of the implications of conflict of interest, reluctance of members to sign such forms, or fear of implications, as well as corrective actions to be included in the improvement plan. Ask a volunteer to read out eligibility requirement O.
CCM meeting minutes demonstrate that CCMs follow the procedure to prevent, manage, and mitigate conflict of interest.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
Percentage of CCM meeting minutes in the past 12 months in which procedures to prevent, manage, and mitigate conflict of interest has been applied. Percentage of CCM meeting minutes in the past 12 months in which procedures to prevent, manage, and mitigate conflict of interest has been applied.
Non-compliant. Less than 60% of CCM meeting minutes in the past 12 months show that procedures to prevent, handle, and mitigate conflict of interest were applied. Indeterminate compliance. Between 60 and 89% of CCM meeting minutes in the past 12 months show that procedures to prevent, handle, and mitigate conflict of interest were applied. Fully compliant. Between 90 and 100% of CCM meeting minutes in the past 12 months show that procedures to prevent, handle, and mitigate conflict of interest were applied.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. Vivavu CCM may submit the minutes of the CCM meeting during which the conflict of interest was applied. However, What is required here are the 5 latest CCM meeting minutes. In order to avoid the non-compliant rating, Vivavo's CCM may argue that there have been undocumented yet numerous instances of application of the conflict of interest policy over the past 12 months. As a facilitator, you will acknowledge those efforts but point out the necessity of documenting them. Unless 60 to 89% of CCM minutes over the past 12 months clearly show that the conflict of interest policy has been applied, the rating should be non-compliant. You should also draw Vivavo CCM's attention to the fact that an increased awareness of the policy among CCM members will lead those with a conflict of interest to declare their conflict of interest and recuse themselves from decision making. This will help in avoiding awkward situations where CCM members are asked to leave the room. Critically, point out the numerous occasions on which the CCM could have prevented, handled, and mitigated conflict of interest given its heavy agenda over the past 12 months. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to input information which explains the rating. For instance, insufficient documentation of CCM meetings or lack of awareness of the eligibility requirement and of its implications, as well as corrective actions to be included in the improvement plan, such as CCM sensitization to the conflict of interest policy, more systematic documenting of CCM meetings, or more reference to the conflict of interest policy. Ask a volunteer to read out minimum standard P.
To guarantee effective decision-making, the CCM ensures that the number of members in the CCM with conflict of interest does not exceed one person per constituency, excluding the ex officio members with no voting rights.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
Not more than one CCM member with voting rights per constituency is in a position of conflict of interest as per the conflict of interest declaration forms.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant. The number of CCM members with conflict of interest is 2 or more for more than one of the constituencies, and quorum at meetings cannot be achieved in most cases. Indeterminate compliance. The number of CCM members with conflict of interest is 2 for one of the constituencies, and it jeopardizes quorum at the meetings. Fully compliant. The number of CCM members with conflict of interest does not exceed 1 per constituency.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. There are no signed declarations of conflict of interest yet in Vivavo's CCM. An official census of Vivavo's CCM members with a conflict of interest has not yet been conducted. The only type of documentation that Vivavo's CCM may submit for this indicator are CCM meeting minutes. Vivavo's performance for this minimum standard is non-compliant. In order to bring the CCM members to acknowledge this lack of performance, you, as a facilitator, will help them understand the need to count members with conflict of interest, why quorum cannot be achieved if 2 or more members for more than one constituency have a conflict of interest, what needs to happen if Vivavo's CCM is to comply with this minimum standard. In this column, you can encourage the CCM to enter information which explains the rating, such as limited awareness of the conflict of interest policy and of the minimum standard, or absence of official information on which members have a conflict of interest, as well as corrective actions to be included in the improvement plan, such as signed declarations of conflict of interest per constituency.